Fighters, protect the cruisers.
What's up, nerds? If you love sci-fi, chances are you have heard of Star Wars. And if you like your sci-fi served with giant robots, then you probably know about Mobile Suit Gundam. These two franchises are great and both have some of my favorite fictional war machines. TIE Fighters, Star Destroyers, Zakus, and Gundams. It's hard not to wonder what would happen if these two worlds collided. In this Versus video, I will have 3 sections. The first will outline the scenario in which I think the two sides would meet. The second part will discuss the warships and the machines that would likely be involved on each side and each of their capabilities. And then in the final section, I will discuss the tactics each side would employ and how I think that battle would go. I've done my best to provide unbiased information and I think an unbiased result. But obviously I am human and can't be 100% perfect at that. So if you disagree at any of the points or assumptions I'm making, that's cool. Feel free to let me know down in the comments. So now let's get started. Who will be fighting and why? Of all the governments in Star Wars, the Empire was by far the most aggressive, and we also know from the Star Wars novels and comics, Emperor Palpatine was invested in mapping out the unknown regions. For those reasons, I think they would be the most likely to discover our planet, which the Gundam universe is set in. In this scenario, I'll assume the Empire has a small fleet and is focused on exploration. So who will the Empire fight against? Well, that depends on when they arrive. For this first video, I will include the space forces used during the 1-year war. So that means I'm going to include the Principality of Zeon and the Earth Federation. In case you are unfamiliar with the Gundam universe, here is an oversimplified explanation of the 1-year war in a single sentence. Zeon is the 4th German Reich in outer space, and they started a war against the existing government, the Earth Federation, to champion the rights of the people living in outer space, even though Zeon really just wants to rule everything. The Zeons will initially be the most affected by the arrival of the Galactic Empire, since they live in outer space. I also think the Earth Federation would join forces with the Zeons for one simple reason. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Now that we know who is fighting, it's time to discuss the battleships, technology, and combat machines each side has. Even though at the strategic level, this is a 2-on-1 fight against the Empire, you might be surprised how even I believe this fight will still be. The Imperial Star Destroyer is the perfect symbol of the Galactic Empire. It has incredible firepower at its disposal, with an armament of 50 turbo lasers and 50 ion cannons. A single Star Destroyer has more guns than the average space fleet in Gundam. ISDs also have attractor beams on board, allowing them to trap enemy vessels and destroy them or take them captive. Also, Star Destroyers have shield generators, a piece of technology that is completely lacking almost in the Gundam universe. In this battle, I've decided that 3 Star Destroyers sounds reasonable for a reconnaissance mission. This way, the fleet could intimidate any primitive civilization they encounter or subdue any more advanced civilizations, thus incorporating them into the Empire. Another war machine that defines the Empire is the TIE Fighter. TIE Fighters are generally inferior to most of their opponents. However, this scenario may give them an opportunity to shine. Shielding is rarely seen in Gundam and does not appear in the 1-year war, to my knowledge. This means that, for once, TIE Fighters actually have the opportunity to inflict serious damage on their targets with their opening shots. A single Star Destroyer can carry 72 TIE Fighters, so that means there will be a total of 216 TIE Fighters deployed in this battle. Now for their opponents. The Zeon's primary warship is the Musai. A single Musai has 3 twin megaparticle cannons, 12 missile launchers, and most are not equipped with AAA guns, so that'll make it difficult to shoot incoming fighters. Also for this battle, we'll assume that the damage of a turbo laser and a mega particle cannon are similar, with one key difference. turbo lasers have a longer effective range. In their respective universes, Star Destroyers are shown bombarding the surfaces of planets from orbit. But in Gundam, this never happens. Therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume Star Destroyers have a range advantage. But as consolation, the Musais do have missile launchers, which could help against those shields. Zeon started the war with 60 Musais in their main battle fleet, according to Gundam The Origins, the OVA. Zeon also had limited resources compared to their opponents, so I'm going to assume again those 60 Musais are all that's available to repel the Star Destroyers. In Gundam, starfighters are replaced with mobile suits, giant mechanical robots piloted by people. The Zaku II mobile suit is to Zeon as the TIE fighter is to the Empire, the mainstay of its fighting force. Zaku's have a variety of ranged and melee weapons at their disposal, including a 120mm machine gun, a bazooka, a battle axe, and even a spiked pauldron on their shoulder if they have nothing else. Since Zaku's have an oversized machine gun, this raises an interesting question. Could shields in Star Wars block physical bullets? I'm going to assume that answer is yes. However, since TIE fighters don't have shields, to begin with, that means Zaku's won't have to worry about that in any dogfights. One final thing about the Zaku's, these mobile suits can fly really fast. A regular Zaku in space can fly at around 6,000 kilometers an hour, or 3,764 miles per hour. That makes them 5 times faster than a TIE fighter. A single Musai could carry 4 Zaku's. So with 60 Musais, that means 240 Zaku's would be available to fight against the 216 TIE fighters and 3 Star Destroyers. So that's Zeon's contribution. What does the Earth Federation have? At the onset of the One-Year War, the Federation believed their space fleet would be the answer to the threat of Zeon and even their mobile suits. The Magellan-class battleships were the pride of the fleet, with 7 twin mega-particle cannons. These battleships had more than double the firepower of Zeon's Musai-class cruisers. Magellans also had 14 anti-aircraft turrets, so in theory they are capable of defending themselves against smaller opponents. Not only are these ships powerful, but the Federation has lots of them. 60 of them in total were available at the Battle of Loom. In addition to these battleships, the Federation had 180 Salamis-class cruisers available. One Salamis-class cruiser has 6 single mega-particle cannons, 8 missile launchers, and also 8 AAA turrets to help them with close defense. The Earth Federation would go on to develop mobile suits en masse in the later stages of the One-Year War, but we're going to ignore them for now, since they weren't developed yet. If you are familiar with the Gundam universe, then you'll know that I'm using the relative strength of Zeon and the Earth Federation fleets just prior to the Battle of Loom, as described in the Gundam The Origins OVA. Alright, now that I've set it all up, it's time for the battle. At the start of the battle, the Empire would probably line its ships into a defensive, diamond-shaped formation. Assuming the commander is of average Imperial ability, they could at least properly organize their fleet for a large, set-piece battle. 2 Star Destroyers in front and 1 behind. This way, the first 2 ships can offer supporting fire to each other, and the reserve ship can reinforce whichever side gets hit the hardest. The Federation and Zeon would temporarily cease hostilities to throw out the invaders. The Zeons would focus on the destroyer nearest them. Technically, it's 60 against 1, but a single Star Destroyer has its 50 turbo lasers and 50 ion cannons, and each of them outrange their opponents. Zeon would suffer light losses as the gunners test their aim, and probably around 10 Musais would be destroyed and or immobilized. Zeon's commanding officer, Admiral Dozel, would then order his ships to full speed and close the distance, and then launch mobile suits. Meanwhile, the Earth Federation would maneuver to surround the other Star Destroyer on all sides. At first, they would be in no hurry. They want to learn from Zeon's experience what their foe is capable of. They would also need that time to maneuver all of their 240 ships into position so that they can bring all of their firepower to bear. But, just like Zeon, they would learn their new foes outrange them significantly. Admiral Revel would then order all his fleets to charge ahead and get in firing range. At this point, it would become clear to the Federation forces that while they are positioned to take advantage of the firepower available from their 240 warships, it also means the Star Destroyer is in more of a position to use its available gunners against them. Because the target density of the Federation is so great, they would probably lose around 30 ships in the opening shots before getting into firing range themselves, just because there are so many of them. The Imperial commander would see the Federation as the greatest numerical threat, so they would move to reinforce the flank on that side. Around this time, the Star Destroyers would start launching their own TIE fighters. Against the Federation, the TIE fighters would find mixed results. Their blaster fire would deal serious damage to the unshielded ships. They probably lack the power to outright destroy them, but they would render the damaged sections inoperable. But being unshielded themselves, they would suffer heavy losses to the numerous AAA turrets and batteries on the Earth Federation cruisers and battleships. TIE fighter pilots would have a hard time evading their fire since they are used to bright visible laser bolts shooting at them instead of bullets. Meanwhile, the Federation battleships would finally close the distance and start opening fire. It would take some time to get through the Star Destroyer's shields, but with so many ships, they will make it, eventually. The Federation would also have lost even more ships getting to this point. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle, the Zeons too would face heavy losses against the TIE fighters. Their cruisers, the Musai, also lack shields, but also severely lack any basic anti-aircraft capabilities, as their fleet was mainly designed to fight against heavy capital ships of the Federation. The TIE fighter squadrons would think they are getting the best of them, but then they would receive urgent calls to fall back to their main Star Destroyer. This is because the Zaku mobile suits, being 5 times faster than a TIE fighter, would have rocketed past them and immediately set about shooting everything with their 120mm machine guns and 280mm bazookas. The Zeons would at this stage have around 200 Zakus available out of that initial 240. For the most part, the Zeon's pilots would realize that the ship is being protected by some sort of energy field. The only parts really vulnerable to the bazookas would be the open hangar down at the bottom and the ship's engines. These sections would be totally wrecked. In desperation against all the other parts of the ship, the Zakus would pull out their heat hawks, which are basically superheated battle axes. These will wreak havoc on anything they touch, much like a lightsaber. While they won't destroy the ISD outright, they will render all the turbo lasers and ion cannons useless. The TIE fighters would return and attempt to engage the Zakus, but that would not go so well. Again, the Zakus are still 5 times faster than a TIE fighter, so with little effort, the Zakus can avoid the blaster bolts from TIE fighter. The TIE fighters would also find it hard to maneuver against the Zaku mobile suits, because in Star Wars, starfighters maneuver like a traditional fighter aircraft. They don't keep their forward momentum unless they are constantly accelerating, and they need to use that momentum in order to turn around. However, mobile suits can move forward and rotate themselves using their Bernier vents. For that reason, TIE fighters would find it very hard to score hits against them. At this point in the battle, both sides are bloodied. The Empire has basically lost one Star Destroyer, and another one has lost its shields and is taking damage quickly. The Zeon's capital ships would be in very bad shape, probably losing about half their total fighting strength at this point. Finally, the Earth Federation will not be the proud sight it once was. They would lose at least half of their Magellan-class battleships and Salamis Cruisers by now. For the Earth Federation, their losses would be because of two reasons. First, they chose to attack the Star Destroyer from multiple sides. While this increased how much firepower the Earth Federation could bring against the Star Destroyer, it also meant the Star Destroyer could point more of its guns at them. The second reason is the Imperial commander chose to reinforce this Star Destroyer because of the sheer number of ships it was up against. And that would basically double the total number of turrets shooting at the Earth Federation ships. At this same moment, the Imperial commander would likely decide that now is the time to save their own skin and their ship. The Imperial pilots would see their flagship turning away, preparing to jump back home. Left behind, the Star Destroyer attacked by the Federation would eventually lose all of its guns and blow up from the sheer bombardment it's been subjected to. The remaining crippled Star Destroyer, savaged by the Zakus with their melee weapons, would become an object of intense study for both the Federation and Zeon forces for years to come. So the final result, a tactical victory for the forces of the Gundam universe. Star Wars has the advantage in shielding and raw firepower. If a larger Imperial fleet was present, I would think it would be too much for them to handle. But I think the small fleet that I outlined here is reasonable, considering it's on a mission to explore and subjugate newly discovered planets which they would think are underdeveloped compared to them. If it was just the battleships fighting this entire battle, then the Empire would probably win. But the mobile suits were the deciding factor in the end. The mobile suits were surprisingly fast, and even if they slowed down to the speed of a TIE fighter, they are still more maneuverable. A TIE fighter would have to waste precious time turning around, whereas mobile suits can freely rotate which way they are facing and still go in the same direction. Furthermore, mobile suits have a variety of weapons, ranged and melee. These weapons would allow them to destroy critical targets and bypassing shields, and they can also switch weapons to suit whichever opponent they are facing, whether it be the TIE fighter or the battleship. Also remember that this is a tactical victory for the Gundam universe. They won the battle against the Empire, but if the Empire decided to return with greater force, there is little hope that the Gundam universe could win a war. This is because Gundam is limited in scope to just our solar system, and only has the resources of a solar system to raise against the forces of an entire galactic empire. So strategically, the Empire will always win in the long run. Well, that about wraps up this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I think I've only just scratched the surface here. In this video, I limited myself to the most well-known technologies and weapons and systems in each respective universe. In the future, I want to dive in how I think individual characters from each of these universes would fare in a matchup. In this entry, I didn't want to go too much into the Gundam commanders because I thought it would be totally unfair. In Star Wars, we have a few named characters in an entire galaxy full of people and intelligent alien species. Whereas in Gundam, there is only a single planet with life, and that's where everyone is coming from. So because of that difference in scale, it's a whole lot easier on the Gundam side to give the Gundam forces just the people they need to always win. If you liked this video, please give it a like, and let me know down in the comments what you would want to see in an ongoing Star Wars vs. Gundam series. If you didn't like it, that's cool, drop a dislike. But if you really enjoyed this video, or just want to see your friends roast me, consider sharing it. Finally, if you want to see more videos from me, hit the subscribe. And with that, thanks again for watching, and stay nerdy, my friends.